not be as good as the kids were last night, and probably 3 times as long. For those that weren't here, we had a wonderful Devar Torah last evening. Our 3rd graders gave the Devar Torah. They really did a wonderful job, and the bima was packed with young people, and it was encouraging to see so much enthusiasm coming from kids. And hopefully we'll see that again. We have the Shabbat squad and Tat Shabbat happening in the other rooms, and they're in costume for Purim, so hopefully they'll be here on the bima soon enough as well. No, I have to be a little serious. It was a serious week. So Ilhan Omar. Her tweets and her comments may no longer matter. Whether she remains on the House Foreign Affairs Committee or is expelled from it, it may be irrelevant. Now, the last decade has largely been shaped by the attention economy. And to re-educate us, I've spoken about it before from the bima, economics is driven by scarcity. And depending on when in human history that scarcity, it could have been land or resources or labor or knowledge. In 2019, the battle being waged is not for oil or land or water. It is for today's greatest scarcity. Facebook, Google, Vine, Snapchat, Twitch, Amazon, Periscope. I can't even name them all because there's so many. I don't even know if all those still exist. Every media outlet in existence, they're all competing for the most lucrative commodity in today's economy, our attention. And the attention economy of the present has determined that extremism sells. Not ISIS extremism. R. Kelly extremism. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Rush Limbaugh extremism. And I'm not referring to political positions as much as I am to sound bites. And regardless of political affiliation, I think we can all agree that each of the individuals whose names I just mentioned, each has articulated an extreme statement that only a decade ago would have been inconceivable in the public square. In a world where we scroll through thousands of images and stories a day, algorithms are employed by social media conglomerates to inundate our devices with the extreme, the ridiculous, the unbelievable, so that our attention is captured and we click and we're addicted, all of us. It's destroyed what we used to call the news. There's no more news, only sensational editorialism intended to keep us watching, clicking, or reading. The attention economy has proven extremism sells, and the media has followed suit. Sensationalism is the progenitor of extremism. That's where the media comes into play. CNN, not news. Neither is Fox. Regardless of which you prefer, I think we can agree that both have devolved into propaganda machines that have forced Americans into opposing ideological boxes that are growing further and further apart from one another. I can remember, all of you can, I can remember a show, it was called Hannity and Combs. It was Hannity and Combs. My father and I used to watch it on Fox together. It had a counterpart on CNN called Crossfire. And the show, Hannity and Combs, it entertained debate, conversation, between an outspoken liberal and an outspoken conservative, and while it may have tilted towards the conservative, it at least provided competing points of view in a single setting. You didn't need to change the channel. It didn't simply augment or affirm an already established point of view from the viewer. Now that series, Hannity and Combs, it premiered in 1996, and like its counterpart on CNN, it began shifting its point of view around the early 2000s. By 2006, 75% of the interviews conducted on Hannity and Combs were with conservatives or Republicans. Alan Combs left the show in 2008, and by 2019, we all know that if you are a Democrat, you watch one station. If you are a Republican, you watch the other. And they're unmitigating of their criticism of each other. The news reduced to a never-ending editorial, cognizant of the fact that ratings are directly related to sensational and sensational editorializing. And it's pushed us to the extremes of the spectrum. Politics has been gobbled up by this trend. It has hijacked moral issues, forcing us into heated disagreement about race immigration, healthcare, bathroom policies, the national anthem. Everything is elevated to a partisan issue. In 2016, on Kol Nidre, I said from this bima that just as a rooster, by rote instinct, announces the rising sun with a cackling crow every morning, so too should human beings be able to instantly differentiate between right and wrong, good and bad. Even as politics corrupts certain moral issues, some should remain as obvious as the contrast between the darkness of night and the light of day. Anti-Semitism, bigotry in all its forms, should be as obvious as night and day. I said that in 2016. Now, Ted Deutsch eloquently wondered the same thing as he stood and questioned the anti-bigotry resolution that was passed by the House on Thursday. And he said, "We're having this debate because of the language of one of our colleagues, language that suggests Jews like me, who serve in the United States in Congress and whose father earned a Purple Heart fighting the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge, that we are not loyal Americans. Why are we unable to singularly condemn anti-Semitism?" he asked. "Why can't we call it anti-Semitism and show we've learned the lesson of history?" And the sad answer, my friends, is that even anti-Semitism has been gobbled up by partisan politics. Deutsch continued, "It feels like we're only able to call out the use of anti-Semitic language by a colleague of ours, any colleague of ours, if we're addressing all forms of hatred. And it feels like we can't say it's anti-Semitism unless everyone agrees that it's anti-Semitism. Who, he asked, who gets to define what counts as stereotypes and discrimination?" And then, sadly, the president's response to the House's failure to call a spade was predictably sensational. "Democrats have become an anti-Israel and anti-Jewish party," he said. And it's not true, whoever just said that. It's not true. And what's percolating is the most threatening form of anti-Semitism, dwarfing any tweet, any misstatement by a freshman congresswoman from Minnesota. Last week, the chasm separating the two poles of our country had an array of causes, leaving us in a state of despair and without answer as to how to bridge the divide separating America. Late-night TV thrives on creating comedy about all the things polarizing society. But when division is whittled down to one cause, it becomes quite easy to find a solution. And if the Jews are singled out as the fault line of the country, it's a problem. Listen to this. We moderns have an insatiable appetite for constant stimulation by dramatic, world-shaking events. Our emotions feed on headlines, and our minds like to be jarred by exciting news of colossal proportions. Here's the problem. That was written in 1963 by Rabbi Norman Lamb of Yeshiva University, and he was reflecting on a situation that perhaps is no longer possible. It was when the news shut down. There was a strike that prevented people from reading the newspaper. Headlines stopped. The Daily News, New York Journal of America, the New York Times, the New York World Telegram and Sun, the New York Daily Mirror, New York Herald Tribune, New York Post, and the Long Island Star Journal, etc. They stopped printing because of a statewide strike, and for weeks the breakfast table feuds over the front page stopped. For weeks, Sunday mornings weren't hijacked by headlines. Faces were no longer hidden behind open newspapers. And for Rabbi Lamb, this was a revelation. He said, "We've learned for several weeks that life can be quite interesting even without this external stimuli. We've learned to fall back upon our own inner resources without being incessantly pricked and shocked by big threats and terrible scandals and imminent attacks. We actually can get along without these jarring headlines. Life, we've discovered, has its own justification in the little things that occur to us every day." In 1963, he wrote that. Imagine his commentary on 2019. Smartphones, Facebook, 24-hour news stations. The headline is being ceaselessly delivered, not just in the morning. And the sensationalism inspired by the attention economy, giving birth to extremism on both the left and the right, could not have been foreseen by Rabbi Lamb. Rabbi Lamb was not anti-news. He was simply pointing out in 1963, before cable television, never mind the internet, that the sensational headline intentionally steals our attention. And the more frequent and more sensational the headlines get, the more divided we become, and the less capable we are of seeing the little things that connect us. And when Jews not only become the headline, but the source of division and strife, history has warned that the reaction is simple, it is swift, and it is dangerous. So now let's project the Torah onto last week's events. I shared a Midrash from this week's Parsha on Wednesday. It helps us greatly. And it says that when Moshe completed the building of the tabernacle, which we've been reading about for weeks and weeks, he turned to the Israelites and he said, Come, I'm going to give you complete details of all the expenditures involved in this incredible process of building. I know all of you donated at least a half a shekel, never mind the gold and the silver, the wood, the linen, the precious stones. That's a lot of money to account for. Here's the final invoice, says Moshe. And then he begins. But when Moses finishes tallying up the total, comparing what was spent with what was collected, the book didn't balance. He's 1,775 shekels short. And to Moshe's dismay, there were 1,775 shekels unaccounted for, and he thought to himself, Achshav Yisrael motzin yedeim lemor Moshe natlan. The Israelites will have to say and reason, Moses took the money. Moses dipped his hand into the till. And then the Midrash continues. God illuminated Moses' eyes, and he realized he'd simply overlooked, not noticed, the vavim lamudim, the small hooks that kept the tabernacle together. He was so busy looking at the proverbial headline, the tapestries, ornate decorations of gold and silvers, the overall craftsmanship, all that was intentionally designed to capture attention, that he missed the hooks that held the whole thing together. My friends, even Moshe Rabbeinu was susceptible to focusing on the sensational. Even Moses was susceptible to overlooking the simple, the plain, the unassuming. He was hypnotized by that proverbial headline. And we too depend on our eyes being illuminated to see not just the obvious tear ripping through the fabric of society, but also the small hooks trying to hold that same fabric together. And herein lay my assessment of what's happening with respect to the American Jewish community and my charge for the day and the weeks ahead. As Jews, we need to do anything and everything to prevent us from being the sensational headline of division in this country. Netanyahu, Michael Cohen, Israel, Ilhan Omar. If we're fingered as the fault line, dividing the right from the left, it won't be long before the right and left realize we're also the hooks that actually connect the divided country. And it sounds sensational unto itself, had it not occurred in almost every other nation throughout our 2,000-year diaspora. Historians refer to this as the Jewish question, a wide-ranging debate pertaining to the appropriate status and treatment of Jews in society. According to Holocaust scholar Lucy Davidovitz, the term Jewish question, as introduced in Western Europe during the 18th century, was initially a neutral expression for the negative attitude towards the apparent and persistent singularity of the Jews as a people against the background of new nation states. In other words, what we saw in Congress last week was an extension of a long-standing tradition of nations debating the status and the treatment of Jews, replete with our country's first installment of a solution, an anti-bigotry resolution. It's called the Jewish question. It's called the Jewish question primarily because the subject, us the Jews, divides. And history warns that nations eventually come to look beyond the sensational headline, polarizing its citizens, and recognize the tiny hooks holding its nation together. If we are elevated and isolated as the question, the problem, the cause, and need not be nefarious or intentional, just disproportionate, if every storyline covering the fragmentation of the United States has a Jewish angle, it's not difficult. It's not a large intellectual leap for the Jews to also be the solution to the problem. A scapegoating of Jews has been the hook relied upon to hold a nation together for a millennia. Bret Stephens wrote, "Ideas once thought of as intellectually uncouth and morally repulsive have suddenly become merely controversial. It's how anti-Zionism has abruptly become an acceptable point of view in reputable circles. It's why anti-Semitism is just outside the frame bidding to get in. The secret," he says, "the secret of anti-Semitism has always rested in part on creating the perception that the anti-Semite is in fact the victim of the Jews and their allies." That's a dangerous position for us to be in. We don't want to be a hook that connects a divided country because we're everyone's common enemy. Which means that as Americans, we are obligated to recalibrate focus from all that is intentionally designed and orchestrated to capture our attention to the understated hooks actually holding this country together. The understated and often ignored similarities that bind us as Americans to one another. History suggests that if we fail at this, a distaste for Jews will become the nation's hook. Not on my watch. The United States of America is the greatest country in the world, held together by unprecedented ideas that guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all its citizens. This needs to be emphasized again and again and again. May God open the eyes of us all, as he did for Moshe Rabbeinu, so that we recognize what actually makes America great and what binds us together to form a united states. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.